There's a moment that arrives quietly after life starts moving again. Not a breakthrough, not a realization you can explain, just a shift in how effort feels. You're still doing things, still showing up, still participating in your life, but you're not pushing yourself through it anymore. And at first, that can feel almost suspicious, because effort has been the engine for so long. Effort kept you safe. Effort kept you moving. Effort made sure you didn't fall behind. So when effort begins to soften, the mind wants to step in and ask questions. Am I doing enough? Am I being lazy? Am I losing my edge? But something deeper already knows the answer. This isn't collapse, it's trust. I remember noticing this shift not as confidence, but as relief. The constant internal pressure to manage myself had eased. I wasn't narrating my choices as much. I wasn't evaluating every move. I wasn't measuring progress the way I used to. I was acting, but without the tightness. And that difference matters, because effort, when it's driven by fear, always comes with tension. Even when it's productive, even when it succeeds. Trust doesn't feel like that. Trust feels spacious, not careless, not reckless, just unforced. Before this stage, most movement comes from self-management. We push ourselves to stay ahead of discomfort. We motivate ourselves to avoid falling apart. We correct ourselves constantly, and that works until awareness shows you how exhausting it is. Trust replaces effort when you no longer believe that you need to be controlled to function. When you realize that presence does more than pressure ever did. This doesn't happen all at once. At first, effort loosens in small places. You stop rehearsing conversations. You stop forcing enthusiasm. You stop correcting your feelings in real time. You let things be slightly imperfect, and nothing falls apart. That's how trust begins. It builds through experience, not affirmation. You learn quietly that you don't disappear when you relax, that life doesn't punish you for being honest about your energy, that you can slow down without losing direction. This stage can feel almost too simple. There's less internal drama, less urgency, less striving to be on. And because of that, some people mistake it for disengagement. But disengagement pulls away. This stage leans in without gripping. You still care. You just don't carry everything on your back anymore. One of the clearest signs of this shift is how you relate to mistakes. Before, mistakes meant correction, adjustment, self-criticism. Now they register as information. You notice them, you respond, but you don't collapse around them, because trust doesn't need perfection to function. It needs honesty, and honesty is easier to sustain than effort. You also notice how decisions change. You're not overthinking as much. Not because you're avoiding thought, but because thought isn't running the show. You feel into choices. You notice how something lands in your body, whether it tightens you or opens you. And you let that matter. Not absolutely, not blindly, but enough to listen. This is where intuition becomes practical. Not mystical, not dramatic, just usable. You don't need a story to justify your pace. You don't need permission to rest. You don't need momentum to prove you're alive. You trust yourself to respond when response is needed. And that trust changes how effort shows up. Effort becomes optional. Something you apply deliberately, not something you live inside of. You still work, still commit, still follow through. But effort is no longer the baseline. Presence is. This is a big internal shift, because presence doesn't rush. It doesn't overcorrect. It doesn't panic when things are unclear. It stays with what's here until something real asks for movement. And when movement comes from trust, it's efficient in a different way. You do less but waste less energy. You choose fewer things but feel more aligned with them. You don't scatter yourself trying to cover every base. You stand where you are and move from there. This stage also changes how you relate to uncertainty. Before, uncertainty felt like danger, something to solve, something to eliminate. Now, uncertainty feels neutral, not comfortable, not threatening, just open. You don't need certainty to act anymore. You trust that clarity can arrive after you begin. And because of that, you're less rigid, more adaptable, more responsive to life as it unfolds. Trust doesn't mean you stop caring about outcomes. It means outcomes don't determine your worth. You can invest in something without attaching your identity to its success. You can try without protecting yourself from failure in advance. That freedom is subtle, but it's real. This is also where comparison loses its grip. Not because you've transcended it, but because it feels irrelevant. You're not running the same race anymore. You're not measuring yourself against timelines that don't fit you. You're moving at a pace that makes sense from the inside. And that internal coherence brings calm. Not excitement, not achievement. Calm. The kind that lets you sleep. The kind that doesn't need validation. This stage doesn't mean life becomes easy. Challenges still come. Decisions still matter. Effort is still required sometimes. But effort is no longer fueled by fear of falling apart. It's fueled by choice. And choice feels different in the body. Lighter, cleaner. You engage because you want to, not because you're afraid of what happens if you don't. That distinction is everything. Trust also changes how you relate to others. You're less reactive, less defensive, not because you're detached, but because you're not bracing all the time. You don't need to protect an image. You don't need to manage impressions. You show up more simply. And simplicity is grounding for you and for the people around you. This is often when life starts to feel more livable. Not because circumstances improve dramatically, but because you stopped fighting yourself inside them. You're no longer using effort to override your own experience. You're working with it, and that cooperation creates ease. Not permanent ease, not perfect ease, but enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to trust the next step will show itself. Enough to stop forcing the path. This stage doesn't announce itself. You might not even notice it happening. You just realize one day that you're not as tired as you used to be, that your thoughts aren't as loud, that you're responding more and reacting less, that effort has become a tool instead of a way of life. And that's when you understand something important. Trust didn't replace effort because you became better. It replaced effort because you became honest. Honest about your limits. Honest about your energy. Honest about what actually matters now. And honesty doesn't need force to sustain itself. Carries its own momentum. So if you've noticed yourself doing less mental managing, if you've felt effort soften without everything collapsing, if you're moving through life with less pressure to prove you're doing it right, you're not losing discipline. You're gaining trust. And trust is quieter than effort, but far more stable. It doesn't rush you. It doesn't threaten you. It doesn't demand constant reassurance. It simply says, you can handle what comes, and you can. Not because you're prepared for everything, but because you're present enough to meet whatever arrives. You're still unfinished. You always will be. But now you're unfinished without tension, without self-surveillance, without effort gripping every moment. You're living from trust. And trust doesn't need to be loud to carry you forward. It just needs to be real. And it is.